Okay, I'm getting a message that we're streaming on Facebook. Oh, and I'm seeing us on Facebook in a delayed fashion. That's very distracting. I'm taking that away. Great. That was awesome. Okay. Facebook just we're still streaming, but ooh. Are you hearing me saying all that again? This Facebook thing may not work. I don't know why it's doing that. Does anyone know why it's doing that? Okay.
I only heard you say it once.
Yeah, I'm not getting any double.
You're not? Okay. Just me. All right. We'll see if my...
That's because you're special.
Thank you. We'll see if my brain can handle this. Well, welcome everybody to our virtual press conference sponsored by the Stop the Polluting Port Coalition. I'm Dita Seed, and today we're going to hear from our team that's been investigating the business case for the $53 million transloading facility that the Utah Inland Port Authority says it wants to build. So in a nutshell, what we found is that there's no business case for the transloading facility. The evidence shows it doesn't make sense from a business perspective to build this facility. Also, the transloading facility will not, as claimed, reduce emissions, and there's no benefit to taxpayers. So after we hear from our speakers, we'll take questions. And first, we're going to hear from Malin Minch. Malin spent nearly 4 decades providing legal, economic, and technical analysis of public utility issues at the federal level. Now retired, he volunteers for a wide range of environmental organizations.
So today, the Stop the Polluting Port Coalition is presenting an objective study of the strengths and weaknesses of the Utah Inland Port Authority's strategic business plan. You may wonder why we commissioned such a study. For years now, many Utah decision makers have embraced the idea that Salt Lake City is destined to be a nationally important logistics hub simply because it is where 2 interstates, a rail line, and an airport converge. They were told that the city sits on a logistical gold mine due to its geography alone. That gold rush mentality was contagious. Our decision makers came to believe that the inland port would make our city the logistics hub of the West, that this project would have the biggest economic impact Utah has ever seen, that its potential is so vast and so certain that port managers could design the inland port airplane as they fly it, and the public couldn't possibly lose. To our decision makers, the next step seemed simple. Find some tax money and start digging for the logistical mother lode that must be there. For 20 years, one of my jobs was to write technical opinions evaluating the Postal Service's logistics networks. Armed with that background, these grandiose expectations for an inland port in Utah seem to defy common sense. So I read the literature on supply chain design, and that confirmed what I suspected. To be a viable inland port, there is a list of must-haves that Salt Lake City doesn't have. It is not a major market in its own right, either for imports or exports. It is not on the way to or from major markets. Salt Lake City is a side trip from the high volume freight lanes. It is not within a few hours drive of the seaports to which it is trying to be connected, meaning Utah truckers couldn't shuttle containers between the Southern California seaports and their warehouses multiple times a day, as the warehouse complexes in Los Angeles now do. And Salt Lake City doesn't have a deep pool of local blue-collar labor. Labor shortages are breaking supply chains, both domestic and international. And they would be even worse and more likely to do so in Utah with its exceptionally tight labor market. There's an additional thing that I realized reading the supply chain literature, and that is that inland ports almost always are proposed and built at the impetus of the local Class 1 rail line. And that's because it offers them a chance to expand their market and increase their profits in that locality. So Salt Lake Inland Port's first idea was to build a second intermodal yard, in addition to the one that Union Pacific already has in the Northwest quadrant. And the idea was if they built a second intermodal yard north of I-80, they could support a gigantic warehouse farm north of I-80. The trouble was they couldn't interest the NSF to do that, and they had to abandon that as their basic strategy for building an inland port. So they turned to a different strategy, which was to build a transloading facility. But to make that viable, they had to interest Union Pacific in allowing them direct access from their transloading facility they wanted to build to the Union Pacific intermodal yard. To this day, Union Pacific is not interested. So the fact that you have none of the Class 1 railroads showing any interest whatsoever in turning the Northwest quadrant into an inland port is telling. So I learned something else from the literature as I read on the supply chain design issues. There are two separate supply chains that span the Pacific. The first one serves the big boys, the Walmarts and the Home Depots. They can benefit from transloading, but they only benefit if it's done early in the distribution sequence near the seaport. Utah is far too remote from the Southern California seaports to attract the business of importers who use the big boy supply chain. As the inland port's potential market, that leaves only the small boy supply chain. That's the supply chain that the regional food and drugs like Fred Meyer or Smith's and other regional importers resort to. Unfortunately, the small boy supply chain isn't set up to use an inland port services. They would pay a steep price for transloading and they would not benefit whatsoever. So considering these basic facts, it seemed to me that the Utah Inland Ports business plan was poised to fail. So I looked for an expert who could tell me if I was right. No one in this country is better equipped to evaluate the viability of the Utah Inland Ports business plan than Dr. Robert Leachman. He is a former Union Pacific employee, and therefore he has hands-on experience with the Trans-Pacific supply chain. He has published academic research on that chain and has extensively consulted for governments and private industry on how supply chain infrastructure can be improved. Incidentally, he's a man of many talents. In his spare time, he designs multi-billion-dollar semiconductor chip fabrication plants. So you can tell that he's a brilliant guy. So I wrote to Dr. Leachman and I asked, would he objectively evaluate the inland ports business model, identifying both its strengths and its weaknesses? And he accepted that task. No one of his level of expertise has ever studied the viability of building an inland port in Salt Lake City. Until this study, no one has sat down and done the math. Systematically surveying who a Utah Inland Ports customers might be, what services they might buy, and at what prices. His conclusions are eye-opening, and I'll let him describe them.
Thank you, Malin. I think Malin already summarized it to some extent, but let me try to explain a little more. I think import supply chains are not well understood. And if I do a little explanation, we start to see what goes wrong with this proposal. The typical marine container coming across the Pacific was loaded at a single factory in the Far East and therefore contains a very narrow range of goods that one factory makes. And of course, and the stuff coming across the Pacific is almost entirely retail goods. It's not inputs to manufacture. And so one container load of a very narrow range of goods is way too much for any single store to try and sell. And for many goods, it's even way too much for all the stores in a particular region to try and sell in the short run. And so that gives rise to the need to get things out of the marine containers and sort them and then create loads of the full portfolio of goods that a store will sell to dispatch to the retail outlets. So that's what distribution centers are for. And for the retailers in the Intermountain region, most of those distribution centers are in the greater Salt Lake area, relatively close to the Union Pacific terminal. As Malin mentioned, the large importers practice transloading at close to the Southern California ports, where those goods where one container load is even too much for one region, they can break those open. If they take many containers from many different factory origins and bring them to the same transload facility, then they can create blended mixed loads of the wide portfolio of goods that's suitable for a region for retailing, and then dispatch those, say, to the Intermountain region distribution center near Salt Lake City. So if you do transloading further inland, you have to keep the goods separate from the Far East to there, so you're not able to pool the regional demands with the West Coast, so you're losing the inventory benefits. And then the second thing is that transloading is not cheap. The containers coming over from the Far East, the goods are not on pallets, they're not on slip sheets, and except for electronics, they're not shrink wrap. And this means you can't use a forklift to take out big chunks of goods at once, but you have to handle them manually, carton by carton. So there's a lot of labor intensity involved in stripping out marine containers, sorting and reloading domestic vehicles. Even those who practice transloading and with big volumes and have annual contracts with third-party logistics companies running the transload facilities pay on the order of $500 a marine container to do this. It's been noted by the UIPA people that the marine containers are smaller than our domestic trucks, and you can unload 3 marine containers and fit that much freight in 2 domestic vehicles. So it looks like there could be some transportation savings. But then that 3 for 2, if you spend $1,500 to strip out 3 marine containers, then you need to find $1,500 in transportation savings, which means you're going to have to truck hundreds of miles to make that up. Whereas the trip in Salt Lake City from the UP intermodal terminal to a distribution center is maybe a $200 dray at most, not $1,500. So that's not a value proposition if you're sending goods to distribution centers in the Salt Lake area. You could only try to recover that if you were sending goods very far away, and that's inefficient because it's much cheaper to send them directly from a cross dock on the West Coast, where you can pool with the huge West Coast demands and get more inventory economies. So as Malin said, it's not a value proposition to the large importers. For the smaller importers, 3 containers is a huge chunk of stuff. Is 1 container maybe a monthly supply or something. So it's not a value proposition for them either. It's that they're not able to make use of it. So I'm afraid the backers will have a very tough time trying to find a market for this facility. I just don't think it's there. So with that, I'll pause and pass it to the next speaker.
Thank you, Professor Leachman. So now we're going to hear from Dr. Brian Minch. He's the board chair of Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment, and he's a founding leader of the Stop the Polluting Port Coalition.
Thank you, Dita. Almost immediately after the 2018 legislation that created the Port Authority was passed, the port was battered by public backlash over the logical concerns of aggravating air pollution and for facilitating the export of fossil fuels and water-intensive alfalfa. Even though most people knew very little about it, within only a few months, a poll found that over 60% of the Salt Lake Valley voters opposed the port, and pollution was the largest reason. Public protests were ignited, port meetings became focal points of civil disobedience and controversial physical confrontations. Port officials' narratives then changed. Fossil fuels would no longer be shipped in and out of Salt Lake City, and shipping upgrades would magically improve our air quality. Port employees and consultants told legislators and the public that trains would replace trucks, and their supposed efficiency advantage would clean our air. The problem with that narrative is several-fold. To begin with, per ton of goods moved, trains produce more nitrogen oxides than trucks, especially if the trains are older vintage diesel engines, tier 0 or tier 1, which most of the trains and transloading switcher engines are in Utah. Nitrogen oxides are a trifecta of pollution because they are toxic in and of themselves, and they are precursors to both of the high volume pollutants, PM2.5 and ozone. Diesel mechanics have told us that one train can produce as much pollution as 10,000 cars. The whole point of the port was to massively increase the flow of goods far beyond what would have otherwise met the purchasing power of Salt Lake, Utah, and the Intermountain region consumers. And there's no way that could happen without increased emissions, no matter what the transportation system was used. Professor Leachman's analysis reveals another reason why the port will not decrease our air pollution, because it is not likely to impact the ratio of truck traffic to train traffic. His report states, quote, "The proposed facility is also unlikely to foster any significant reduction in emissions of import supply chains in the Intermountain region. The proposed facility does not make it any easier or any more economically justifiable for importers to secure rail movement of marine containers from the San Pedro Bay ports to Salt Lake City." Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Next, we're going to hear from Craig Wallentyne, a retired business executive with experience in marine, rail, truck, barge, air, and cold chain supply chain management.
Thanks, Dita. Good morning. My name is Craig Wallentyne, and I'll be speaking to you about the prospects of export promotion via the proposed inland port transloading facility. Dr. Leachman's report highlights that promoting Utah exports will be problematic for a number of different reasons. First, the vast majority of Utahns create value in a service economy. A taxpayer-funded investment in a government-run rail transloading facility provides no value and no new employment opportunities to those working in healthcare, education, banking, finance, or our fast-growing software companies. Second, by dollar value, most Utah physical exports are high-value goods such as precious metals, semiconductors, aerospace products, communication components, medical devices, and essential oils. And these are usually shipped by air or truck and not as containerized cargoes. As Dr. Leachman's study shows, and the inland port's own feasibility study confirms, the expanding Salt Lake City International Airport is the important transport hub for these products, not a new taxpayer-funded rail facility at the inland port. Next, per Dr. Leachman's report, the only containerized exports from Utah to which the inland port rail project might apply are commodity agricultural goods and other basic materials produced at disparate points remote from Salt Lake City and consolidated here. These types of exports have a significant issue in that the volume of containerized bulk exports from Utah is much, much smaller than the amount of containerized retail imports that the experts have been just mentioning to the Intermountain region. In other words, we have a lot more retail containers coming in versus export containers going out. Now, this creates an expensive imbalance for ocean carriers and railroads who are reluctant to take on the financial penalty of handling slow-moving containers in the Intermountain region versus more profitable work at coastal ports and their local support facilities. Finally, considering the very high likelihood that Utah water prices are going to be steadily increasing in the future in order to preserve the Great Salt Lake, the volume of commodity agricultural products being exported out of Utah is likely to decline sharply. In summary, Dr. Leachman's report highlights that investing Utah taxpayer money in a government-run rail loading facility for exports is not a wise business strategy. Thanks, and back to you, Dina.
Thanks, Craig. And finally, our last speaker is Katie Pappas. She's a Salt Lake City resident and a founding leader of the Stop the Polluting Port Coalition.
Thanks, Dita. The Utah Inland Port, the brainchild of Utah legislators, was created in the last hours of the 2018 legislative session. With promises of economic development, cleaner air, good high-paying jobs, and supply chain benefits, they set the wheels in motion with millions of taxpayer dollars. Since that time, close to $40 million have been spent, and taxpayer-backed bonds amounting to $150 million have been issued. Property tax differential collected in the area now primarily benefits UIPA. A new transloading facility would be the heart of the inland port and what differentiates it from an ordinary warehouse district. Over the last 4+ years, concerned residents of the Salt Lake Valley have voiced a number of concerns regarding the development of an inland port on the west side. Among these have been health effects on Salt Lake City in general, with a focus on already impacted west side communities. This would mostly be the result of air pollution coming from increased traffic and development. Cost to taxpayers that primarily benefit private businesses. We haven't known if this project is even financially viable. Effects on ecosystems, including the already threatened Great Salt Lake and its wetlands, wildlife, and migratory birds. Quality of jobs, most of which would be low-paying and subject to future automation. Increased pesticide spraying in the area. Stormwater runoff from contaminated parking areas. Negative impacts on residents at the new Utah State Prison who are unable to leave the area. The inland port has always been a terrific gamble of taxpayer dollars with far too many unknowns. The risks of getting it wrong are too great. Many of us have asked the Inland Port Board repeatedly for studies that would give us important information about the future effects of the port would have on our city and all of us. We've asked for a master development plan, traffic, air quality, and environmental studies, and a human health risk assessment. Up until now, none of these have been done. In Dr. Robert Leachman's study, we have long-awaited answers to our questions related to decreased pollution, profitability, potential advantages to the supply chain, and benefits to the taxpayers supporting port development. The business argument for an inland port with its transloading facility is unraveling. At the end of his summary, Dr. Leachman suggests other possible options for the area and ways to make development significantly cleaner. There should be a halt to this entire project and those alternatives considered. Then, reasonable and beneficial development based on these projections should primarily occur south of I-80. Land that is north of I-80 in the port area and has been harder to develop should be considered for preservation and enhancement of the Great Salt Lake ecosystem. A business or manufacturing district can be built in many different places. Areas where we can make a difference for the future of the lake are much more limited. And we mustn't forget, the lake also benefits our economy, both directly through industry and tourism, and indirectly by enhancing our snowpack and sustaining a healthy ecosystem. It's time to start making smart choices based on science and research. Time to acknowledge that often land is most valuable in its natural state. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. And now I think we're going back to Malin for a few final thoughts, and then we'll take questions.
Thanks, Dita. As a community, we have spent over $30 million on the Inland Port project, and we're still trying to account for where that money went. We have borrowed another $150 million, and the public has no idea what it's going to be spent on. Even the Port Authority doesn't know. They have treated these funds like monopoly money. It's astonishing that we have gotten this deep into the Inland Port project without anyone producing a concrete business plan. No one has tried to identify specific use cases for an inland port services and what its potential users would be willing to pay for them until now in Dr. Leachman's study. He found that there is essentially no demand for seaport-like services when they are obtained 800 miles away from the seaport in a tiny market outside of the major freight transportation lanes. He found that the key services that high volume importers obtain from the Los Angeles seaports actually have negative value when performed far away in Salt Lake. He also found that there's no value for low volume importers either. Dr. Leachman has laid out for the public why the inland port's current business model will almost certainly fail. The moral of the story is that the inland port needs a program audit even more badly than it needs a financial audit. Dr. Leachman's study shows that it's time to let go of the illusion that Utah can build an Atlantis of international trade in the Utah desert. Time for us to stop trying to make the city do what it can. Replicate the services of the Southern California seaports from 800 miles away. And it's time, once again, to let Salt Lake City plan for and develop its own logistics infrastructure. It's time to return our community's focus to developing logistics services for the Intermountain region itself as cheaply, efficiently, and cleanly as possible. That is a realistic and worthy goal.
Thanks, Malin. So now we'll open it up for questions. And I just want to preface this part of the conversation by saying, I should have said this at the beginning, the Stop the Polluting Port Coalition is made up of community volunteers. And it's somewhat amazing that it's taking the efforts of community volunteers to raise the red flag on this project. And, you know, we've been at it for 4 years. And a week ago, a legislative audit was released. It wasn't a complete audit, but it basically validated all of our concerns. And now here we're presenting another set of concerns related to a very expensive infrastructure project that now we found is not economically viable, will not reduce emissions, and basically would be another waste of taxpayer dollars. So with that, are there any questions?
Yeah, I've got one. This is Roger McDonough with KCPW Public Radio. And Dr. Leachman, a question for you just on the business side, and leaving aside Dr. Mensch's questions on environmental problems or on, you know, export questions that were brought up as well, or the Great Salt Lake. It sounds like you're saying that for shipping imports, that by bypassing the coast, meaning the western coast, you are bypassing the major market where the major population center is and where the demand for goods is. And as a result, that it's not efficient and it doesn't work as a business model to bring those shipping containers here and then, you know, sort of distribute them from here. Is there any chance, though, that through, you know, a deal between ports on the coast and what UIPA is trying to build, that they might get some sort of spillover of shipping containers, and that they could make, is there a market for stuff that's waiting in line for Utah to take those leftovers and make something profitable out of it? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I quite understand you, but it is the stuff would need to come to Salt Lake City in the marine containers on a train to be useful in this transload facility. If the marine containers have already been broken open in the West Coast and the goods allocated, then it doesn't have a purpose. And then, so even for a Fred Meyer or a Smith's or somebody who may be importing stuff, they'll have their distribution center right in the Salt Lake area for, you know, that's the centroid for the whole Intermountain region. So they're not going to be able to recover the transload costs, you know, of $1,500 for 3 when it's only $100 or $200 dray to their warehouse from the transload facility. So there just isn't a business proposition for the regional guys or for the nationwide guys.
Thanks.
I might just jump in a second and say what a dray is. A dray is a industrial term of art for a short truck trip. So what he's saying, what Dr. Leachman is saying is, you're asking an importer to spend $1,500 unpacking 3 marine containers in Salt Lake City. And the only benefit he's going to derive from that is $100 or $200 for this dray trip from the UP intermodal facility to the local warehouse. And nobody can sustain a business model like that.
This question's for Dr. Leachman and perhaps Malin Mensch as well. In your analysis, did you try and reverse engineer the rosy conclusion that the state and lawmakers reached to see if that penciled out? Because you're looking at data presumably that they would have had access to as well. I'm just kind of curious your analysis of their conclusions.
Well, what I've seen of theirs is pretty sketchy. I mean, I haven't seen anything that kind of identifies exactly what the market is or how they would succeed. So I just started from my own knowledge of having studied the Far East of U.S. import supply chains for the last 20 years. I think it's useful to think about history. Is if we go back to when goods were made in the Midwest and eastern part of the U.S. instead of the Far East, then there was very successful transloading at the Freeport Center up by Clearfield, where the box cars of appliances and farm implements would come out, be inventoried here, and then reshipped to all the West Coast markets. So there you're pooling all the West Coast markets and you get all the inventory efficiencies, and the transloading makes sense. As we converted the Midwest and the East into the Rust Belt, as everything was outsourced to the Far East, they tried to keep Clearfield going to work it in the reverse direction, to take imports from the Far East and then distribute them to the rest of the US. And that effort failed for the same reasons that this wouldn't work. And I'm kind of disappointed that the Utah leaders seem to have forgot their own history. Is that you tried this before and it didn't work. So why do you think it'll work now?
Malin, do you have any read on that from looking at utilities at the federal level for the last 4 decades? Any possible scenario that you saw in reverse engineering what the state's conclusions have been?
Well, when I was analyzing logistics for the United States Postal Service, for example, what you need to do is you need to put your major, I'm sorry about this phone. Hold on a second. It's an old-fashioned landline, and I have not figured out how to shut it off. But when you're analyzing a logistics network for the Postal Service, you want to figure out where your big processing centers are going to be. And you locate the big processing center either where there is a mail production facility. Say all of the major banks like to produce their billing from one place, which they do. And so you build a big processing center next to it. If you don't build it next to a big source of, in this case, exports, then you look at the market and say, where do I have the most mail receivers in the most concentrated area, so that you reduce the average time taking the mail that's been sorted and delivering it. You cut the average distance to the minimum. So that means you're looking at where are the major markets, and you put your facility in the middle of that. That applies to supply chains from the Far East. And there's a rule of thumb in the logistics literature that I read that you don't try to build an inland port, a dry port, far away from seaports, unless you have an import market big enough to support it. And usually that's defined as having at least 10 million consumers within a radius of 300 miles. Salt Lake City has at best 3.5 million people within a radius of 300 miles. So if you're an importer, you decide, do I want to locate my major region-wide distribution center in Salt Lake, where I can reach maybe 3.5 million people in a day's drive from, if you're driving a semi? Or do I want to put it in Los Angeles, where I can reach 10 times that many within a day's drive? Well, your choice is pretty simple. You put it in Los Angeles, where you can reach 10 times as many people with the same length of truck trip. You wouldn't, it's not rational really to decide to locate your distribution center in Salt Lake for any market, any import market that is beyond the Intermountain area. Because if you want to serve beyond the Intermountain area, you go to the demographic center of your import market. The other side of the story is exports. Chicago has inland ports, and they thrive, and they can convince the marine containers, that the importers that use marine containers from the Far East, they can convince those people to send those marine containers all the way to Chicago. Why can they do that? Because Chicago has all kinds of bulk item exports. All those agricultural goods are produced in a close radius around Chicago, Illinois. The industrial goods that the Midwest used to produce is now a place where they can produce raw materials and ship them out too. But you have a thriving export business, and Chicago's in the middle of it. You don't have anything comparable to that in Salt Lake. The top 10 export items from Utah are 2/3 of all exports, and they all, except for one class of ore, go by air freight. So in terms of the value of exports, it's very slight, and it is always going to be very slight, as Craig mentioned. So imports, you wouldn't come to Salt Lake unless there was absolutely no other option to build your facility. Exports, you wouldn't come to Salt Lake because we don't have any. Simple as that.
Thank you.
Dita, can I ask a question that Dr. Leachman might address? And that is, there is, I think, the assumption within a lot of our political leaders that the pandemic related congestion at the ports would be relieved by building a port in Salt Lake City. Can you address a little bit the aberration of the pandemic and its effect on this, and whether or not it makes sense to have that be the impetus for building inland port infrastructure here?
There's been a lot of wild gyrations with the pandemic. The biggest factor is that Americans staying home and not spending money on travel and entertainment and dining, spending money on things. And so the imports have gone up to a tremendous level, at really an unsustainable level. And this summer, they're finally starting to really drop. At the same time, with so many people getting sick, the logistics industry got very understaffed. And so you had the terrible problems we've had. You know, if you look at where the problems are not at transloading facilities in Southern California. They're at the marine terminals. They're also at the railroads, where at the marine terminals, they're just, you know, they're so buried in containers that they have to do so much digging to get any particular container out. The workload goes up much faster than the volume does. With the railroads, they have cut back on the staff so much, and then they can't get people come back to work, and so stuff sits. But a transloading facility in Salt Lake doesn't address either of those things, and so it's not going to help with that. There's crazy things that have been going on. A lot of the nationwide retailers have shifted imports from the West Coast to the Gulf and East Coast ports to try to get around the congestion. But as we speak, there are 40 container vessels at anchor waiting for a spot at the port of Savannah, Georgia. So all they've really been able to achieve is move the congestion around.
Dr. Leachman, if I can ask one more question. The Port Authority talks about this being a statewide system with satellite ports. And I guess I'm just wondering what you think of that idea of the satellite ports generally, or how your analysis kind of looked at or addressed the concept of satellite ports.
Well, let's think about imports and exports separately. With imports, there simply are hardly any marine containers going anywhere in Utah except to big distribution centers in the greater Salt Lake City area. Because they only have a narrow range of goods, they're completely unsuited for going to a store. It would take them years. They'd have to mark everything down and take a terrible profit hit to deal with that. It's got to go to a distribution center and be sorted, and then you create truckloads to the stores that have the portfolio of goods just to replenish what the store needs. This is the way you can manage inventory. So there is no such thing as satellite for marine container good imports to spread out. Now, the distribution center in Salt Lake, they can truck direct to the stores. So that really might have only a role for exports, where you have, maybe it's alfalfa or molybdenum ores or whatever else. But again, there's, as Craig talked about, there's problems of trying to make a transload facility in Salt Lake City work for restuffing marine containers. First off, a lot of the things like coal and grain are shipped in bulk trains. They're not waterborne containerized freight. And as Brian and Malin mentioned, is ranked by value, the exports of Utah are mainly air freight. It's going out of the Salt Lake City airport. It's not getting repacked in marine containers to go down to the San Pedro Bay ports to go on boats. And then even for what's left, maybe specialty grains or specialty ores or corrugated box scrap or whatever, that is a little bit of waterborne containerized exports from Utah. Is first for the heavy stuff like grains and ores. This stuff is what we call weight freight, meaning you reach the weight limit, the highway weight limit of the vehicle before you fill up the cube. So then the savings of transloading of 2 domestic trucks equals 3 marine containers does not apply. Is that it's going to be once even that domestic truck is not going to be, the cube is not going to be full. That's reached the weight limit. So you don't get any transportation economies from transloading that way, unless you could maybe ship it in railroad cars and then have a transload facility that was equipped to unload railroad cars and reload into marine containers. But even that's problematic because the railroads are not very interested in short haul movement of bulk commodities. They're interested in long haul unit train movements. They can make good money on that. The short haul stuff, they can't make money on it, so they're not interested. So again, it's a real difficult proposition to try to make exports work with this facility. So it's hard for me to see how this network of the regional hubs, feeding the centralized export facility can work. There just isn't enough stuff being exported as sea freight out of Utah for this to work.
I might jump in for a minute also. the literature that I've read about supply chain design says that the fad in the railroad industry these days is something they call progressive railroad management. Not sure I got the term exactly right, but the concept is that railroads are trying to maximize profits by getting away from short haul bulk freight. And they're getting away from hub and spoke configured networks because they don't make money on the short hauls, as Dr. Leachman said. And what they're trying to move to is a focus on point-to-point, high volume market to high volume market over a high volume lane. And nobody's a bigger proponent of this progressive railroad philosophy than Union Pacific. And I know that Union Pacific currently sends some freight all the way to Salt Lake that's ultimately destined for Cedar City. And then they have to backhaul that freight by truck to Cedar City. And that reflects their philosophy that they don't really want to be a milk run. They want to go from high volume market to high volume market with a high volume train that doesn't make any stops on the way. And this philosophy is directly contradictory to the idea of satellite ports. Because satellite ports are low volume and they're hub and spoke and they're milk runs. And it's just not something that you're going to interest a class 1 railroad in doing.
Thanks, Malin. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I have a few. Leah Larson, the Salt Lake Tribune. So the inland port has new leadership and they've kind of signaled that they are moving away from this idea of a transloading facility. So maybe they've come to some of the same conclusions. But Dr. Leachman, you discussed some alternatives that the state could be investing in. They are kind of locked into this land lease where they were going to build the transloading site. So I was wondering if you could go into more detail about what they could be doing instead. I think you mentioned distribution centers that are closer to the market.
Yes, I don't need to tell you people about how rapidly growing the Salt Lake area is. It must be one of the fastest growing urban areas in the US. Some supply chain distribution systems are kind of legacy and they need to catch up. And in particular, I think there are still some retailers where their distribution center for the Intermountain region is on the east side of the Front Range in Colorado. And then they're trucking everything over the mountains to reach retail outlets in Utah. I think if UIPA has good property for building distribution centers close to the UP intermodal terminal, is soliciting those retailers that don't already have a regional distribution center in the Salt Lake City area to build one there and split the region and stop supplying it from Colorado or other faraway points. Is this would be a big public benefit in reducing emissions. It would increase volume handled more efficiently, and I think can be a cost savings for that. It's always a big challenge when companies want to open a new distribution center, of working with commercial real estate companies to try to find a suitable site that's close to a centroid of where their market is. And so if UIPA can help out by having great sites right close into Salt Lake City, I think that's a win-win proposition. I mentioned a couple of other things. It was somewhat surprising is that the lift equipment that's used to lift containers into railroad well cars and lift them out of the railroad well cars onto truck chassis is typically construction grade equipment that creates a lot of emissions. It is possible to get battery powered or even all electric wire powered lift equipment that of course would get rid of those emissions. And it's a surprising percentage of the overall supply chain emissions that's coming from the lift equipment. The railroad typically can't justify it because the initial cost of the battery equipment or all electric cranes is really high. And even though they have a lower operating cost, the life cycle cost is too great. But that might be a useful public investment to say, we can help out with the initial investment as a means of reducing emissions in the greater Salt Lake area, and you can have a lower operating cost as a result, and clean up some of the emissions from the supply chain.
So another thing that the state keeps promising with this port is it's going to be a source of high-paying, career-oriented jobs. But to your point, it seems like what we're seeing popping up in this area is those distribution centers, just a bunch of warehouses, and warehousing jobs aren't necessarily high-paying. So do you see any solutions there? Is there a way to bring high-value jobs and economics to this area so it's not just a bunch of warehouses?
Well, hauling goods is not really high tech. So people in this industry are not really well paid. Is that, there are some well-paying jobs. If you're running a distribution center, right? Then there's some software associated with that. There's some technical, but it's by and large, lower salary employment, the kind of people who work in Amazon fulfillment centers and so on. So, I don't think one should ever think about the logistics industry as a source of high paid jobs. That's just not something it is.
Are there any other questions? Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today. And we're going to post the video of this on our webpage. We've been streaming it on Facebook. And I think that concludes our event, and we'll hopefully see you all in person sometime. Take care.